Good meeting, the trash in the place.
Well, good morning. I think we're going to get started a little bit early, as was mentioned in the last session. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning to the session on the future of AI and neurosciences. It's going to be a busy morning. I think it's a very full session. We're going to have a nice crowd, and we have an hour and 15 minutes pretty much solid because everybody's got to get back up an escalator into the next session, and that's going to be a full session as well. And that includes the QA session, and there's a mic, which I can barely see through the lights, but it is right there in the middle of the aisle, so if you do have questions, please, as far as recording purposes, use that. I'm going to step out of the way and introduce our moderators for the morning. To my second right is Dr. Rudy Tanzi from Mass General Hospital, who's the Vice Chair of Neurology, the Director of the Genetics and Aging Research Unit at Mass General, and the Joseph P. and Rose Kennedy Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. And immediately to my right is Dr. David Silbersweig, who's the Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the Stanley Cobb Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, as well as an Academic Dean for Partners Healthcare at Harvard Medical School. And I will turn it over to you gentlemen and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. So Rudy and I are honored to be able to really just chat with this distinguished group who we have here, and we thought that we would start by maybe telling you a tiny bit about ourselves and how our work may relate to AI in the context of neuroscience and clinical medicine, but really then quickly ask our guests to introduce themselves and say briefly what it is that they do and how AI is figuring into that. And then we're going to have a chat with regard to some of the timely questions about how AI is transforming and holds promise for the research that we do and bringing it finally to the clinic in neurologic and psychiatric disorders. Thank you, Glenn. Glenn introduced me in terms of my titles. In terms of what I do, it's really at the interface of neurology and psychiatry. I'm a neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a functional brain imager. And with regard to my own work and that of my close colleagues and our group, the real advance is that AI and machine learning algorithms are transforming what we can do in brain imaging. We do functional brain imaging of psychiatric disorders, and psychiatric disorders for many years were thought to not be as brain related because you couldn't see a stroke or a tumor or an abscess on a structural image. But with the advent of functional imaging, first PET and now fMRI and related technologies, each of which has its own advantages and limitations, and with algorithms and analytics that allow us to start to extract small signals and identify patterns and profiles of activity that may have clinical relevance and provide a foundation for future diagnostic and therapeutic use. Those are the sorts of things that are happening in my field and that I can get to a little bit more in the context of the conversation.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining our session. I think it's going to be an exciting one, given our panelists. I work in Alzheimer's disease, and I just recently became co-director with Jonathan Rosent of a new Center for Brain Health, the McCann Center for Brain Health at Mass General, where our mantra is, how do we practice early prediction of brain disease and early detection via biomarkers, imaging, and the like, and most importantly, early intervention. And I think the elephant in the room when it comes to Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders is that we don't diagnose them until we have symptoms. And just think about how crazy that would be if we did the same for cancer and heart disease and diabetes. So we have to play some catch up, and I think AI is going to play a huge role there. In my own work, much of what we do is drug discovery. We invented something called Alzheimer's in a dish, where we take human stem cells, turn them into neurons and glia, and grow a mini brain organoid, and then this rapidly allows us to do drug testing. But more interestingly, even though we get several dozen hits of drugs that stop plaques and tangles in that system, the real fun is when you put those use AI and machine learning to say, okay, based on those drugs and the gene expression changes they evoke, what other drugs are out there that might also do the same job? And then based on gene expression changes when we make amyloid in a dish or not, look at that transcriptomic profile. What drugs do those suggest? And how do you merge the two drugs? So many of the decisions, I like to say that I'm PI in my lab right now, but the real PI is becoming AI, because I make suggestions about what drugs to go forward with, and then my postdocs say, well, this program or that program says it should be this and not that. So I'm wondering when PIs become AIs, but so far we still have jobs. But anyway, I think it's a real moving target, and it's an exciting time to be on the cusp in neurological disease of how do we predict early based on genetics, genomics, family history, intervene early based on biomarkers and detection. And we got a great panel who are working in this type of area. So why don't we keep going, and we'll have you introduce yourselves and say a little bit about what you do, and then we'll get the conversation going.
So I'm Oliver Harrison. I think I've got the best job in healthcare, sorry, but so I run a team of about 40 AI scientists, researchers, product designers, engineers, based out of Barcelona. And we're tasked by Telefonica, one of the 5 biggest telecommunications companies in the world, with creating a business that's going to significantly impact the health and happiness of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. We're doing that in partnership with Massachusetts General Hospital and a number of other entities here in Boston and across the US and elsewhere. I'll come back to talk about, so in more precision, exactly what we're doing, but we're really excited about exploring the neurology of the brain, how the brain works, how it goes wrong, looking at how we can detect signals from digital data that come out of our smartphones and our digital lives more broadly, in order to be able to spot those signals, and then develop a toolkit of interventions to help people to become happier and healthier. So my personal journey started when I was 6. 2 things happened. First, I decided I wanted to become a doctor, and second, I got my first PC. And really my life has been dominated professionally by medicine on one side and technology on the other side ever since. So first degree in neuroscience, and then qualified as a medical doctor, worked in psychiatry with a research interest in computational neuroscience. Was really interested in bringing technology, data technology, to the National Health Service in the UK. Couldn't find a track for doing that as an MD, so quit medicine and joined McKinsey, worked in the healthcare practice there for 5 years, and then got an opportunity, I was just talking about this earlier, to build a healthcare system in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, where behavioral disease, if I can include obesity and diabetes in that definition, is really the only show in town. 60% prevalence of type 2 diabetes in over 45s. So really we use data systems to understand the population behavior, some of the deep drivers, the behavioral drivers of medical conditions, and then built a toolkit on top of that to help people to live happier and healthier lives.
Great.
Thank you. Maurizio Fava. I'm the director of the Division of Clinical Research of the MGH Research Institute, also vice chair of psychiatry at Mass General, and associate dean for clinical translational science at Harvard Medical School. I've been interested in AI from the perspective of, as a psychiatrist, of prediction, as well as leveraging digital health and combining digital health with predictive models. I've been particularly interested in kind of the use of AI to enhance the precision of clinical trials. We know that in psychiatry we struggle to conduct informative clinical trials because of the number of problems that arise in the conduct of clinical trials. And I really believe that AI can really help us conduct much more efficient trials, selecting the right patients for our investigations.
I'm Sid Cash. I'm in the Neurology division at Mass General Hospital. My clinical focus has been on patients with epilepsy. My lab work has largely focused on trying to get signals out of the brain so that we could better understand epilepsy, normal cognition, sleep, a whole host of anything we want to know about the brain. And a lot of that focus has been on getting neural data out from patients who are being implanted with electrodes for clinical purposes so that we have intracranial recordings from a lot of electrodes and often from microelectrodes. And years ago, when I first started doing this research, the real design of those studies was to try and understand really basic mechanisms of neural activity. And very quickly it became apparent that I needed to start learning and using the tools that were becoming available from machine learning techniques and AI techniques, because the kind of data that we get tends to be very large and very complicated. A typical patient for us, for example, could easily run to 3 terabytes or so of actual neural data. Now we want to mine that as best we can. Traditional techniques are only so good, and we've started to rely more and more on some of these other approaches that could deal with those sort of large data. And then over the course of years and starting to do that, using, for example, support vector machines to do seizure detection and some amount of seizure prediction, we started to think of other ways where we could use that approach. And me and a colleague, Brandon Westover, who spoke this morning about some sleep-related work, developed this entity within neurology called the Center for Data Animation, CDAC we call it, which is designed or thought to be able to take some of these techniques and these tools, incorporate them into signal processing methods for EEG data, but other kinds of real-time data, couple that with other forms of data from the electronic health record, and come up with ways to better diagnose, predict, and all the things that we've talked about as we go forward, and really start to really utilize those kind of tools to do much better at the things that Rudy was mentioning, our incredible lack of ability to really predict what's going to happen to any of our patients with any of the kinds of diseases that we look at in the neural sphere.
Great. Having heard sort of the first layer of the important work that each of our panelists are doing in their respective fields, we thought that before going into some cross-cutting questions, we'd ask them to then go the next layer down to talk about where the rubber meets the road and how they're actually using AI algorithms, they and their colleagues, to make these transformations, and perhaps with an example of a type of project in which AI is instrumental. So maybe we'll start at the end again,
Sure.
Sid, and then we'll come back.
Backwards this time.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, I think Brandon Westover gave a talk this morning talking about how we're using very large data sets and AI techniques or various different approaches to analyzing that data and coming up with ways to automate what is right now a tedious, subjective task of annotating any form of neural data, in that case, sleep records. A lot of the other research we've done has been in, for example, annotating EEG recordings to understand where epileptic activity is of various sorts. That's right now done purely by hand, by trained experts. It's time consuming. It requires that expertise. We've begun to make machines that'll do that much quicker, much more reliably, or at least much more consistently, both for sleep, as you might have heard this morning, and for seizure detection or epileptic activity detection. Where that really helps us, it helps us in research modalities, and it also helps us clinically. From a research point of view, for us to do investigations of whether or not we understand the mechanisms of those phenomenon, whether we could predict someone's response to a medication, whether we could predict their outcome, for example, to a surgical intervention, relying on all hand-annotated data is very cumbersome. If we're able to actually do this in an automated fashion, we could then leverage that to go into even larger data sets and really pull out these kinds of relationships that are extremely difficult to pull out. So now that we could go through our collection, for example, of thousands of EEGs that the hospital has done over the course of years, we could now automatically go through them, get exact, consistent, and reliable annotation as to whether or not there was a seizure, and then start asking the next level of questions. What medication worked for that patient? What's the genetics of that patient? We can't do that without having these kinds of tools. Clinically speaking, right now, as I said, we have to rely on warm bodies to look at thousands of hours of EEG and determine whether something bad is happening or not. With an automated system, we could move away from that. In a hospital like ours, where we actually have a lot of that capability, we have a lot of excellent fellows who are training and able to look at this. That's not true for much of the rest of the world. We're in a rarefied environment here. We recognize that, and we want to make tools that could actually be transported and used throughout the world where they don't necessarily have the kind of abundance of resources, superabundance of resources, frankly, that we might have. So those are two examples where we might be trying to use it.
So Sid, may I just ask a sort of follow-up question on that? And I think this will be relevant to each of our speakers as well. We're really lucky at Partners and our hospitals to have this critical mass of expertise. And you mentioned the attendings and the fellows who can read these time series quite expertly, et cetera. Do you think that, are the algorithms that you currently have informed by that expertise in a Bayesian sort of way? Or are they just looking for certain frequencies and spikes and waves, or a combination?
So we're actually using both approaches. The majority of what we do relies on the expert as the goldish standard, and we recognize that it's not anywhere close to gold. It's not even a metal. It's something other than that. But that's what we have to rely on. And so for a lot of our research, we do rely on that. We then we're now exploring some other approaches, one of which is to start with that, train up a machine of various sorts, let the AI start running, let it start working, and then use the AI to actually allow another set of annotations that could be done in a smarter, much more elaborate way. The other things that we are pursuing are relatively unsupervised approaches. And again, we can get into some of the technical issues, but using unsupervised learning algorithms that don't rely on anybody to try and pull out. And actually, that's one of the avenues of research that we're most excited about right now, because there's some fundamental questions about, again, I'm focusing on EEG because that's most of what we do, but this is applicable to lots of other signals and other kinds of data. But you're reliant on these sort of nomenclature that's been developed because of history and experts. There's no real sense for some things that that's actually right. And as a psychiatrist, you probably know this way better than we do. We come up with these lists of what things are, but there's no real proof that that's actually how they should be. You could use some of these AI techniques to let the machines figure it out in an agnostic fashion and see whether that maps out. And that's some of what we're doing now in the EEG and other domains. And we have really high hopes that that'll actually push us in directions that we wouldn't otherwise go at all.
Great. Maurizio, you're a pioneer in developing new kinds of clinical trial designs in psychiatry and beyond to address things that are very difficult, like placebo effect, dropout, all of these elements. How is AI helping you and your team to advance design of trials?
Well, I think that AI, there's no question that the predictive value of AI can be very significant. I'll give you an example. Jordan Smoller with Ben Rees from Children's Hospital has developed a kind of an AI application or prediction of suicidal behavior. And with a database of about 1.7 million people, they've shown a fairly good and high specificity in identifying individuals with who either committed suicide or with suicidal behavior, and this prediction can be as early as 5 years. We saw Erica Shinoy with a 5-day prediction of C. diff presentation for suicide. 40,000 people each year die in the United States from suicide. So being able to predict that is very important. In a similar way, we can use AI to predict who's not going to adhere to to treatment in clinical trials. A study by AstraZeneca showed that about 20% of patients participating in CNS drug trials never took the drug during the trial, had no pharmacokinetic demonstration that they had any blood levels at any point during the trial. 20%. Now, those patients will be tremendously uninformative because they're really not taking the drug under investigation. And yet, right now, they enter the trials and we have no idea. So being able to use AI to say, well, this is a patient that, based on prior behavior, right, is very unlikely to adhere to treatment. It'll be highly informative. So I think that a combination of innovation in study designs and AI to help select the right patients, I think it'll be very important.
Along those lines, we should get into Oliver. How can telemonitoring and remote monitoring help in terms of keeping track of whether folks are doing what they're supposed to do on trials, or recruiting in a leaner, meaner way to make sure that, in Alzheimer's, for example, if you recruit for a therapy that's treating tangles by tangle imaging rather than just cognition, there was a paper that came out of Partners where you can save about 5x on recruitment and on trial costs by just getting the right patients based on recruiting those that have the pathology, just rather than broadly going to cognition. So how is Telefonica and the work you're doing play into better trials and managing trials better?
Yeah, so there are a couple of examples. So the first, Sabina Wilhelm, who I think is here somewhere, talked about this morning, our app that we've developed jointly with her group looking at body dysmorphic disorder. The fact that we're using an app means that we can get permissioned access to data from the smartphone, which can tell us is somebody leaving their apartment or not, how are they sleeping, what are their activities of daily living. And that data is available real time, and it can be processed using AI algorithms, and then that insight can be shared with the clinician or fed back to the user themselves. And this is really unheralded. So yes, we've run clinical trials for decades where we've asked study participants to complete questionnaires. We've asked them to report on their own behavior. I'm sure most people in the room here couldn't give a very accurate description of their behavior over the past 14 or 30 days with sleep patterns and so on. But with technology and with the ability to mine that data, we have the opportunity to do that. The second, I think, touches on the question, David, that you mentioned about working in centres of excellence. And I think there's something in the natural evolution of AI-type projects that you need really high-quality data to get started, and you need both training set data and also ground truth data. Now, it tends to be that high-quality training set data and the people who can read and signal, if it's supervised or if it's unsupervised, again, quality of the data is paramount, tend to be in the centres of excellence. But certainly the journey that we're on is trying to make the end result, the algorithm, as intrinsically scalable as possible, where that training set data is not available. And just one quick example of that, we're working with the National Health Service in England on mental health crisis prediction. We're working in the city of Birmingham, where there are 150,000 patients in the catchment area of one of the biggest psychiatric facilities, 25,000 cases of mental health crisis. That's suicide attempt, it's presenting to the ER, it's being picked up by the police suffering from mental illness per year, costing the economy tens of millions of pounds. And we've been using AI approaches to look through the electronic health record data to be able to generate a signal 2 weeks in advance that somebody's at risk of mental health crisis. And we've achieved an AUC of about 80.8, just looking at the HR data. And we find it fascinating that the most powerful approach to doing that is an approach called XG Boost. I'm sure many people in the room don't know what XG Boost is, but effectively what it's saying is if an informed psychiatrist, fully qualified, had all of the available records, all of the available data, could see the trends and the patterns up until this moment, what's the prediction of risk for the coming period? Now, in theory, it would be wonderful if everybody had an attending psychiatrist who was looking at all of their data all of the time and could make that prediction, but of course that's not practical. We don't have enough psychiatrists to go around. But the XG Boost is able to take the experience of those psychiatrists and turn it into a predictive algorithm that does have access to all of that data. And what we're doing next is we're superimposing mobile network data, so that's calls made in or out, SMS in or out, app usage, screen usage, when people went to bed, when they're waking up in the morning, patterns of movement, in order to be able to boost that error under the curve. The vision is that without the EHR data, just with mobile network data, we will be able to predict a significant set of mental health crises, and then that becomes something that can expand outside of even a clinical environment and just become a tool or an app concerned parents or users could actually just install on their phone.
There was a famous movie called Minority Report.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise, based on the short story by Philip Dick, where they could predict who was going to commit a crime in advance, and that was based on certain people that had psychic and empathic abilities. But are we going to get to some point where AI is going to tell us, who are the red, yellows, and greens in society? I mean, and do we have to worry about that? Am I going to be on a list when they start monitoring what I do?
If that's a question back to me, I would love to talk about it because I think we're actually already there in terms of the capability. I mean, define the risk that you're talking about, red, amber, green.
Yeah.
There's risk of heart attack, risk of mental health crisis.
Right.
I think we're there or on the eve of getting there for a large set of very important clinical outcomes. I think this raises a really interesting question of ethics, and obviously last month is a very kind of prescient time to talk about this with Zuckerberg testifying in Congress.
Yeah.
The ethics is absolutely critical, and I cannot emphasize that enough. I think in terms of public trust, it takes a long time to build public trust, but you can lose it in an instant if you do the wrong thing.
So I'm part of something called the Boston Global Forum and the Dukakis Institute that is addressing ethics of AI, and there'll be a meeting coming up this coming month at Harvard on precisely that, because we are entering an age where, especially the more autonomous these algorithms get, the implications, as Rudy said, are protean.
There was a terrific presentation at the Davos Economic Forum by Murali Doraiswamy, in which he talked about some of the ethical dilemmas. Facebook has an algorithm that identifies people at risk for self-harm based on what their postings and what they're watching and so forth. And they will kind of trigger kind of an empathy team intervention. And according to Facebook, they have saved over 100 people from self-harm. On the other hand, the question is, like as you were alluding to, Rudy, is this a kind of minority report scenario where suddenly, only because you're posting some things, people can intrude in your, with a good intention, and deploy an empathy team to help you out. Right. Where do you draw the line?
An empathy SWAT team.
and so so although Murali's presentation at Davos in January of this year focused on AI for prediction of self-harm, you can imagine, for example, there's a clear link between mental illness, untreated mental illness, and violence. When do you start using the same algorithms to predict violence? And I'm sure that, I suspect that right now Homeland Security is using AI. They're already kind of analyzing things in that. But I think these topics are very, very important, and we need to discuss them.
So Rudy, back to the science and the medical aspects. Can you talk about the next layer down in your work, or with regard to degenerative diseases? And is it all about identifying people at risk earlier, and/or is there a possibility for the identification of novel targets in addition to the usual suspects?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but I think we've learned the hard way in Alzheimer's disease, and this would be true for any progressive neurodegenerative disorder, that treating at the time of symptoms, meaning dementia or a movement disorder, is just really tackling the disease too late. I mean, we don't want to give up on those with symptoms, and I think at least in Alzheimer's and other diseases, if you want to help someone who already has symptoms, you need to hit inflammation, neuroinflammation. But in the case of Alzheimer's, plaques, the amyloid plaques, the tangles got you there. So we're seeing a scenario where plaques and tangles are forming earlier in life without symptoms, and they're pushing you up that mountain. And if you look at resilience studies, like Teresa Gomez-Isla does at Partners, people who have lots of plaques and tangles when they die, but didn't have any dementia, what's missing is inflammation. So I think we're starting to learn the temporal order of events. What's the initiator, like amyloid lighting the match, the tangles to the brush fires, inflammation to large forest fire. And a lot of the failed trials that were hitting amyloid Well, we're trying to put out a fire by blowing out the match. So now we need to know when that match is lit. We need to know how many pockets of neurons are dying as tangles spread and nip it in the bud. And that means you need better ways with AI to determine and predict who is at risk, whether that's through biomarkers, imaging, or through remote monitoring of their activities at home and how they're sleeping and what they're doing. And again, you run into that risk of too much big brother, but in terms of an empathy intervention, this would be an intervention where someone is in trouble but doesn't know it because they don't have symptoms yet. So, one of the big questions we have is how do you link together pathological changes in the brain with everyday living changes so that you can hit it from both sides and know when someone needs help with plaques and tangles. Or maybe in the future, at 50 years old or earlier, depending on family history, you will be checked for plaques and we'll have safe drugs that can bring those plaques back down. But a big question is how do we link together the emergence of pathology pre-symptomatically and hit it then? And along those lines, the FDA made an announcement in February, that their new guidelines, that they will allow you to do clinical trials on folks who are pathology positive, symptom negative in Alzheimer's. And for research and clinical purposes, and you wouldn't do this medically, but you would call someone who has concerning pathology in the brain but symptom negative as stage 1, and then test compounds that hit that pathology or biomarkers. I think that's a huge move if the FDA allows us, because that will avoid 15 to 20-year prevention trials that no one wants to do because of their expense and everything else.
Yeah, and this ability to look at the biology and the psychology and to link them in an era of epigenetics and neuroplasticity where we know that there's bidirectional causality and as well as correlation is really important. Nancy Donovan at Partners has been working on loneliness, and the construct of loneliness might at first seem like it's too much of a higher order social construct, but it turns out that it correlates with amyloid, et cetera. And then, of course, and Maurizio, could speak to this. Very often, as someone ages, there's a whole question: is it dementia or is it depression, or is it one presenting looking like the other at first? And as we get to an era where we have biomarkers and biotypes, we're going to be able to ascertain and to treat and predict more selectively.
A quick comment on loneliness is that when you're lonely, meaning not alone, but you're stressed about being alone, you tend to ruminate. You tend to daydream in a negative way about obsessing about the past or anxiety about the future. And that is emphasizing the default mode network. And interestingly, if you look at connectome data, plaques, amyloid plaques begin in the default mode network. When neurons fire in that network, especially when you're ruminating, that's when you make amyloid. And and if you're task-driven and you're learning or you're just focusing on something, you turn that network off and you get a break from amyloid production. So it's a really important thing, I think. How do we bring together, how do we use AI to know how someone's acting at home and how they're feeling and what their stresses are to what's happening in their brain pathologically toward disease or maintaining brain health.
But Rudy, I think you're also alluding to the importance of digital health approaches to rumination. Sabine's work that was presented earlier in the collaboration with Telefonica demonstrates today you can make a difference with the digital health intervention. And you can imagine that the implications down the road, I think Sabine alluded to it, you can move into anxiety, depression, rumination. So you can see that apps could be developed to target different aspects that may enhance brain health and lead to symptom reduction at the same time. So I think that the incorporation of digital health approaches into AI would be very important.
Yes.
And Maurizio, your point about these objective behaviors too is critical, because don't forget that in psychiatric disorders traditionally, it's subjective report or retrospective report or observation of some third person, all of which is really important. But what these technologies and approaches are getting at are providing sort of streams of data, real-time, real-world, that allow cross-correlation and then correlation also with biological measures, which gets to the sort of work that we do with brain imaging and the sort of work that you were mentioning in terms of neural networks. In order, right now, to diagnose a psychiatric disease, we use something called DSM, which is the APA's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's basically a list of symptoms that are endorsed. And you can get to a certain diagnosis through any number of roads, and there's a lot of heterogeneity. And so, for instance, in a clinical trial, are you really studying who you think you're studying, quite aside from are they taking the drug? And what is the nature of the underlying pathophysiology? And so with AI techniques now, we're developing algorithms that can pull out biotypes or profiles of circuit activity in the brain in critical prefrontal and limbic and subcortical and associated pathways, and identify and stratify subtypes that are based upon biology, and biology where the rubber meets the road. So we do systems level neuroscience. It's incredibly important that that be correlated with and informed by, and in turn inform, basic cellular and molecular neuroscience. But it's at the systems level that brain meets mind, and that brain states and mental states can be correlated directly and measured simultaneously. And so the ability to identify final common pathways of symptom expression within and across these disorders, and indeed to start to define a biological taxonomy of these disorders, that's really where the field is going. And if one thinks about the benefit of that for drug trials, for risk reduction within pharma, which had sort of divested from this area because of the failure of Me Too drugs or the inability to make substantial progress. We're really talking about an era, hopefully, where it's going to be like cancer or cardiology, and we won't lose the sophistication, the psychosocial sophistication, but we will gain a whole lot of data and knowledge about the substrate in a way that directly refers to and can be predictive of the psychiatric and therapeutic development.
I'd like to ask Sid, in terms of epilepsy, how is AI being used to, right now, examples to predict a seizure?
So epilepsy is sort of a cautionary tale in many ways for, well, AI or pre-AI, it depends on how you want to define these things. There's been a years-long tradition of trying to predict seizures. The most devastating aspect in epilepsy is the fact that for the vast majority of patients, seizures are absolutely unpredictable. And they might only have them a couple times a month, or maybe even less than that, and yet that's still ruinous. In Massachusetts, for example, if you have one seizure today, you are not allowed to drive for 6 months. So if you have seizures twice a year, you're not driving. You shouldn't be driving. And as you can imagine, that's devastating for working, for example. So the big issue in epilepsy has always been being able to predict the seizure. And there have been decades of work, sophisticated algorithms being used. Without being too pejorative, they've been a massive failure. They just don't work. And there's nothing that's used clinically currently to predict seizures. Why is that? Well, there's lots of possible reasons, and we could spend lots of time talking about that. One of them is that the way these studies have all been done in the past was relatively small amounts of data. That's all relative. At the time, it was seen as large amounts of data, but it's really not that much data when all is said and done. Only recently have people started to try and collect the kind of data that's necessary to really use AI to its maximum extent. And we're still not there yet in the epilepsy domain. It's very hard to get this data. As you mentioned earlier, sort of the getting really well-annotated, high-quality data is difficult, and that's what needs to be done here to really apply these tools. And that's where it's going as sort of
Are there apps that can help? Apps that look at what's happening in the home? And
there's a couple different directions where people are going. There's actually a grant call out currently that wants to combine or wants the applicants to combine some form of at-home monitoring, perhaps with an app where you just list your seizures, with other forms of data collection. So that's the other gap, is being able to have that comparator. You can get apps that people can list their seizures or what meds they're taking or how they feel or all those other things that we've talked about. They're wildly inaccurate most of the time. If they're listing when my seizures were, it turns out that tends to be very, very inaccurate. So there's always been this real desire to have adjunct information. And that's another place where neurology is particularly behind other folks like cardiology. We don't have systems for longitudinally looking at brain neural activity. Cardiologists have it for EKG and so on with implantable loop monitors. We don't have such a thing for the brain, and that's really what's been necessary for epilepsy and for other things as well. Our group has actually been working on trying to develop small implantable devices for that purpose. There's a system out there from a company called NeuroPace. That's an implantable neurostimulator device that does do continuous analysis of EEG over years. So there's now new ways that we could do that and start getting the data we need to actually make the AI that's available actually perform in this domain. I think that's going to be a direction. I think epilepsy is a good test bed for a lot of this where the need is there, but I think we'll be seeing a lot of that kind of work in neuropsychiatric disorders as well, where you want to have longitudinal measures that go beyond something that you might be able to type into your iPhone or movement, but actually collects and is able to let you see the relationship between brain activity, other physiological measures, and the kind of behavior, and tie them all together.
And Sid, you bring up a really important point that points to sort of this next generation of closed loop sort of AI, where you have sensing, and that can be in the brain with electrodes invasively or non-invasively, or smartphone in the real world. And then you have feedback, you have number crunching algorithms that are informed by AI and that have decision support. And then a certain conclusion is reached or threshold is met. And then the data themselves shape the response that's fed back into the brain in the case of stimulation, or fed back on the phone in terms of the intervention, real time, real world, to the patient. And so it's not just smarter number crunching, if you will, but it's that next step of then what you do with those data in real time. And then this ability in terms of suicidality on the horizon to be able to then effect change therapeutically and inform the algorithms and make smarter and smarter algorithms with AI.
And just to divert a little bit, I think a lot of what we've been talking about has emphasized the sort of the outpatient world, the at-home world, which is a good place for emphasis to be. But there's a lot of this work is also happening in the hospital as well, where there's already very large data streams, but remarkably untouched, if you will. In fact, in most places, that data appears, is looked at transiently by somebody, and then disappears. And only recently have institutions like ours and others started to actually collect that data, keep that data, and start to think about how it could be used both for looking retrospectively at diagnosis, at prediction, but also being able to think of these kinds of closed loop approaches. Can I have an AI machine sitting in the background and monitoring, for example, an ICU patient where there's tons of information coming out, it's very complicated, it's very heterogeneous. Can I be monitoring that? Can the AI be monitoring that and saying, well, I think they're at risk for really developing sepsis another couple of days from now, or developing cardiac dysrhythmia, or having difficulties coming off the vent. These kinds of issues, I think, are also being actively looked at as well, where there's already a lot of instrumentation, a lot of data, but it's data that's extremely complicated and difficult to wade through without the kind of tools that AI affords. And I think that's another area we're going to see a lot of burgeoning growth very quickly, actually.
Oliver, are you doing work in that area of linking the remote monitoring to closed loop systems? Or
Very much so.
Yeah.
So I just want to make explicit, I think, what we've implicitly been talking about here, which I think is in part biomarkers, and really trying to identify biomarkers which bridge the pathology, the symptomology, the functional areas, looking at DSM-5, and some of the available data streams. I think if we can get more precise definitions of exactly what we're trying to measure, that's critical for AI methods. And a good biomarker also is a step towards the physician and the patient understanding what it is you're measuring and why. Tom Insel came to visit us last week. He's now running a company called Mindstrong Health based out of Palo Alto. And Mindstrong's looking at harvesting data from smartphones to generate neurocognitive insight for clinical trials and ultimately for health improvement. And we agreed that the biggest challenge right now in our domain is the availability of biomarkers. And in fact, it may well be that the history of DSM and the categorization of mental disorders, which are actually quite heterogeneous, has set us back somewhat. And actually what we need to do is approach the issue, let's say, of depression or dementia with a fresh mind and say actually what is functionally really important for us to be measuring. But closing the loop is very much kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to harvest data with the full informed consent of the user. We're trying to analyze that data to generate insight. We're feeding that insight back to the user and also to a nominated clinician, kind of where applicable. And all of that data is designed to drive a recommendation engine, which is saying, okay, what's the right intervention at the right channel, at the right dose, at the right time for this person to improve a specific outcome. So closing that loop from data capture, analysis, so what, deploy tool, and then remeasure to see the impact of that tool is right at the heart of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an important point too, which is that we don't want to just use the technology and the algorithms to reify our prior inaccurate categorizations. And so that's why the data-driven approaches, the so-called unbiased algorithms that we have, are really allowing us to cut nature at its joints and see what nature has to tell us about different subtypes of mental illness. And once one does that, it becomes no surprise that so many things that we consider comorbid, anxiety and depression, tics in Tourette's syndrome and OCD, ADHD, etc., are really just different varieties of circuit dysfunction of neighboring or converging circuits that overlap. And the more we can precisely define that, the better. I think all of us are bringing up another point too, and maybe Maurizio can speak to this, is there's been, like any area that develops rapidly, there's also been premature claims of success that have given a bad reputation to AI, or to AI as applied to any one of our diseases or techniques. And certainly, you know, the people in private practice who can give a patient, charge a lot of money and give a patient a color picture of their brain electrical map and say that they can diagnose, etc. That's not doing any good for anything except lining the pocket of the person doing that. And it can do harm. And so, Maurizio, what's going to be the turning point where there's a legitimacy or a validation? What needs to happen?
Well, I think that we have to kind of, first of all, recognize what you alluded to, which is the imperfection of the current system. When Dennis Charney, the dean of the medical school at Mount Sinai, investigated how the criteria for major depressive disorder were established, he went back and reached out to the APA committee and the APA committee before then, and eventually they said, well, we adopted the finer criteria. So he reached out to John Feiner and he said, well, how did you come up with those 9 symptoms, you know, that lead to the diagnosis of major depressive disorder? And John Feiner said, I just thought they were right. This was the, you know, so almost a moment of, you know, kind of clinical intuition with no empirical data whatsoever. And those criteria that Feiner developed have been, you know, become like, you know, kind of written in stone, and we make all diagnoses based on that. So when I look at, for example, the presentation by Tom McCoy earlier today on his, you know, computable pharmacology, he alluded to the fact that all antidepressants look equal in meta-analysis. But is that really true? is it really true that cognitive therapy works as well as pharmacotherapy in all patients? I would like personally to see not only the kind of a refinement of diagnosis that steps away a little bit from this very broad heterogeneous diagnosis, but also a matching of right treatment with right patient. Leveraging AI for a form of precision medicine, personalized medicine, so that when I want to use Sabine's app for depression, well, I'm going to use it in this patient and not in that patient, for which perhaps a pharmacotherapy may be a better treatment for. So those types of studies are necessary, empirical validation. So we need to leverage large healthcare systems like the Partners Healthcare to better understand how to better use the treatments that we have. So although Tom McCoy's presentation focused on the burden on kind of treatment decisions based on side effect risk, I think down the road we're going to see AI allowing us to make decisions in psychiatry based on the chances of success, prediction, which treatment will be most effective. And that can really be a game changer.
One of the things that Tom McCoy brings up as well in a recent talk, he was talking about his using EHR to do a GWAS, which I thought was amazing, taking genetic data from a biobank at Partners and then using electronic health records and doing a GWAS strictly with those data and getting genome-wide significant p-values. And much of it brings us back to neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation is playing a role in autism, a psychiatric disease. In Alzheimer's disease, you don't go downhill with symptoms until there's neuroinflammation. There are many routes to neuroinflammation, whether it be plaques and tangles or other causes of neuropsych diseases we don't yet know. But I think it's the elephant in the room. I think that if you look at the extremist who carries out a terrible act of terror, or if you look at a patient suffering with dementia, if we had a better handle on detecting neuroinflammation, if we had to come up with a brain health index, one of the goals of our new brain health center, a BHI, a brain health index, can we get a blood pressure cuff for the brain? I would guess that neuroinflammation as we age is going to be a key indicator. So I'm just wondering if any of the three of you could comment on any state-of-the-art work right now in using AI to assess a brain health index based on neuroinflammation as it pertains to brain health, neuro, and psych disease.
So I think I can speak to that.
Yeah, or you, David.
So with PET scanning, there's a ligand, a PET ligand called PK11195, which binds to activated microglia in the brain, which are the resident immune cells of the brain. That's been around since the early 1990s, late 1980s. It has limitations, shall we say. There are new versions of it, the so-called peripheral benzodiazepine receptor ligands, and they bind to a specific size kilodalton protein on in the mitochondria. And there's something called PBR06 now, PBR28, and people are comparing all of these, and we're using these. And they provide some index, but recently it's been shown that it may not just be inflammation, and that's the same for the so-called free water diffusion imaging that has come out of a lab at the Brigham, because there are things other than inflammation that can cause these signals. So we're zeroing in on things that non-invasively in vivo can provide an index and a localization of neuroinflammation and then a correlation. At the same time, in the periphery, there's a lot of activity of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and the profiling of the immune profiling is advancing as well. And it turns out, through the blood-brain barrier and other phenomena, that peripheral immune status affects central and vice versa. And so I think we're in an era now where we have more tools and there's going to be refinement of those in the next few years. I'm wondering if we should open it up to audience questions. We have about 25 minutes, and would that be all right? And,
Sure.
And please use the microphone, go up to the microphone
Alice.
so that people can hear. And if you could just say your name and where you are.
Yeah, Alex Sherman, Neurological Clinical Research Institute, Mass General. So I would love to play a contrarian here. It seems that AI is a very cool thing to use, but majority of the things that we're discussing today and around the world is more known as our expert systems and decision support systems. And it seems nowadays, whatever we want to say, oh, computers, it's AI. So on this part, I would suggest that I was wondering what are the new trends that maybe not AI per se, but could be used as an expert system in clinical trials. And so as some of you know, I'm more involved in this. And what we did recently in ALS, another neurodegenerative disease, is we merged data from 23 clinical trials data sets, harmonized, put it up for grabs, and did a crowdsourcing challenge. And out of 1,100 solvers, we selected 3 winners, and none of the winners had anything to do with ALS nor with medicine. And one company that won, they were so proud of their win that they spun off a bioinformatics company. And this company builds predictive models for neurodegenerative diseases. And closer to what Maurizio was mentioning, I was surprised actually, only 1 hour into this discussion, precision medicine was mentioned. So majority of the things we're talking about is precision medicine. And what we're doing there is how do you randomize people? I mean, eligibility criteria management and selecting precision selection of patients is one thing. But how do you randomize people into clinical trials? Because what we do, if we know predictive paths of those patients into this trial, we basically accidentally seeing these patients at the point of randomization, and then they may deviate from these paths, and we're still thinking that they're of the same. So this company, and they go to SBIR, we're working with them, is the opposite. So they're predicting where these patients will end up at the end of the clinical trial, and then you randomize based on that predictive algorithm. And that's maybe, I don't know, Maurizio, probably a question to you, is it doable or feasible in psychiatric diseases, because it's more or less okay in neurology?
Well, Alex, you're absolutely right. It's going to be critical in clinical trials, in CNS clinical trials in particular. Roberto Benigni and I analyzed the database from the ALS consortium and showed that there is a bimodal distribution in the progression of the disease in ALS. There's a group that in 6 or 9 months stays about the same as a 5% decline, and there's another group that at 6 to 9 months has a 50% decline in functioning. So very, very different. And so you can imagine that if you're trying to demonstrate a disease modification in ALS in patients who stay like this, how can you demonstrate anything against placebo? Because on placebo, people remain stable. So being able to predict where people will be at the end will help with the placebo problem in CNS clinical trials and particularly neurodegenerative trials. Now, the question is, how do we get there, and how do we, what buy-in will we get from the FDA when we say, well, we want this person but not that person? But I think that the incorporation of precision medicine into clinical trials is absolutely critical.
So if I may also so when you're at this stage in the hype curve of a number of things happen, and one of the things is that the tight use of language tends to go out of the window. So you're absolutely right to say that some of the things we've discussed today, maybe some of the things that people attribute to AI aren't in themselves within a tight definition of AI. And I think one of the hallmarks that we should hold ourselves to is a a blend of deductive and inductive approaches to the analysis of data and an iterative analysis of data. And this came to mind 10 years ago while I was Director of Public Health in Abu Dhabi, and we built data systems to harvest a lot of clinical information for the whole population, around 3 million people. And we were looking at heart attack. And we found a remarkable correlation that wasn't in the literature at the time of markers of an inflammatory episode between a week and 2 weeks prior an acute myocardial infarction. And we hypothesized, wrote it up and hypothesized that a stable plaque destabilizes when it's exposed to inflammatory cytokines. You have more hemodynamic stress on coronary arteries and so on. But the point I'm trying to make is that we had applied inductive approaches to analyzing a large data set and just said to the machines, you figure out the correlations and then we'll take a look at it, rather than bringing the Framingham cardiovascular risk factors to the data set and having tunnel vision, because we've been too hypothesis-led.
Yeah, so agnostic, yeah.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hello, Christoph Potempa. I'm the founder and director of Brain Cures. We have a platform technology that can catalyze precision medicine based on biological intelligence from a paradigm like synaptic plasticity that we know has led to treatments like memantine and other brain disease treatments. However, these treatments are not perfect. As we know very well at Brain Cures, there is a proprietary initiation step that we have overlooked. And I have been working on this since 2004, and now we are ready to sort of go from data playing to action. And now to relate to things that have been said in the panel, I think one of the challenges is really how do we get us as a whole group to participate, right, to create baselines that then allow us to possibly identify the trajectories at which we can intervene, which I think Telefonica is doing. Then I think another issue, which would be interesting to hear your comments on, is you could say better data sharing, right? We are generating these haystacks of data, but few people are able to find the needles, but the promises are much greater than the capacities at the moment for artificial intelligence. It is very promising, but I think we need a bit more collaboration, so it would be great also to get your comments on transparency and data sharing, because we know data is useless if it's just sitting there. It's really the trade secrets that allow, say, Brain Cures and a few other companies in the world to make these.
But part of that is also, if you're going to be sharing databases and combining database, is coming to some, I guess for lack of a better word, pre-competitive agreements on the structure and the format and making data collection uniform. And so I think we need more of the early work in terms of if we're going to collect data in certain domains and create larger databases, make sure that those data can be interchangeable and merged seamlessly.
And also, you mentioned that you have to develop organoids, right? We know that it's challenging to get anything from preclinical research because everyone's using a bit different model. So even though we may be testing a lot of drugs, the companies will actually have to open up their data.
So how much is going on in terms of the idea of making data more easily, more seamlessly mergeable among databases?
There's a huge, from the NIH point of view, for example, there's a tremendous effort in this regard. Part of the BRAIN initiative, which was started by Obama a number of years ago now, a major part of that has been coming up with ways that the kinds of data that we're all talking about can in fact be shared. I think the conclusion is everybody agrees the data should be shared more, and nobody yet agrees, as far as I could tell, exactly how to do that. There's not only the technical hurdles, but there are significant, we always say, oh, we all got this data, it's just sitting around, just doing nothing. Well, most of that data actually took a lot of work to get. And we tend to not necessarily acknowledge that, and that's a hurdle for just saying, hey, let's just make it all completely available. So a lot of people are very interested in this. There's now lots of working groups at the NIH and other places that are setting up ways to come up with uniform standards and ways that data can in fact be shared.
There's
of course,
a
there's
business model
precedence for
there.
it in the genetics world. There's been a lot of precedence for this and how to deal with that. It's a little bit of a different scenario in my mind, but there's certainly a lot of eager people trying to figure out how to work on that.
I was actually at the Association of American Physicians meeting over the weekend in Chicago, and Jeff Drazen gave the keynote lecture, the editor of New England Journal of Medicine, and he had a slide that showed, how all these databases are generated by principal investigators, and now you have kind of the big data experts wanted to merge these databases, and he alluded to the reluctance that sometimes investigators say, I worked so hard to produce this, will I lose the benefit? But I think the NIH, thank God, is really pushing back on that kind of parochial view of, well, I generated the data, I got to hold on to it, and so many of these databases are now available.
Yeah, and it's really important to transcend these more selfish and parochial desires. At the same time, and as a dean at the medical school, where people need to be promoted, and people need to get credit for their work. Companies put in money at risk and investors so that they can have certain proprietary IP, et cetera. So the question is how, as I think you're alluding to, in the real world, we sort of combine in a academia, industry, government partnerships the interests and protect interests, but also incentivize more transcendent behavior.
Sorry, just if I may, just very quickly. There's industry track record in doing this, so generating standards for the benefit of the entire industry. So one for telecommunications is the standard which is 4G or 3G or 2G WAP. So those standards are the result of commercial companies, for-profit companies, sitting around a table and saying that the entire industry will move forward if we can get from 1 megabit per second to a gigabit per second. We don't have all of the IP, but we've got some darn useful stuff. And there's a structure around sharing that IP in order that the entire game moves forward. I think that kind of approach would be hugely valuable in brain science and AI. The question is who could convene that? NIH has been super helpful from the payer, the funding side, but could that conversation be convened? Because it doesn't matter how good my data set is, it's not as good as the sum total of everybody else's data sets, right? So if everybody shared, then it would benefit the entire industry.
You need a pre-competitive.
I think it's happening, and I'm not sure it's happening the right way or the fastest way, but it's certainly happening where there are groups thinking about standards for different kinds of data, and also for the issue of sort of preclinical data. There's lots and lots of ugly history of preclinical trials having really excitement, then it moves to clinical trials and it's total failure. So there's now all this NIH ideas about reproducibility and rigor and so on and so forth, with the idea that maybe we can get better at doing that. So we're not there, but we're hopefully heading in the right direction.
I'm Barry Fogel. I'm a neurologist and psychiatrist at the Brigham. I have a comment and a question for the panel. So the comment is, I think that when you have treatments that benefit 70% of patients and get 40% to remit, like you have in major depression, you're never going to cure stigma. But when you have a way of matching patients with treatments where you're hitting 85 or 90% remissions, it's not just going to get better results, it's going to destigmatize the disease. Absolutely. And I think that given the fact that most people with depression don't get diagnosed, most get diagnosed, don't get treated, and most that get treated don't get treated to remission, having this kind of ability to raise the rate of remission by matching patients and treatments is a huge deal, even beyond what it does for an individual patient, what it does for public health. The question I want to raise is this, a very practical one, which is when you want to do a clinical trial of a new drug, the FDA is ultra-conservative. They want you to use the same old metrics that everybody else has used. They want you to have either deal with variability in the patient population, either by including everybody and then having ridiculous variance, or by having exclusion criteria that exclude the people you might actually want to treat and making the results not generalizable. So in a way of thinking about it is you'd want to use endpoints that, because they would be biological and measured by instrumentation, they'd have much lower error variance, so that you could have much more highly powered studies. It'd be a lot cheaper. And then you'd look at variability in the clinical population as a covariate rather than a criterion for exclusion. Now, every conversation I've had with people at the FDA is, well, that's very nice, and maybe you can have it as a secondary endpoint, but the primary endpoint has to be what everybody's always done. The exclusions have to be what we've always had. So I'd like your thoughts about it.
Well, you know, when Tom Loughran retired from being the director of the Division of Psychiatry Products at the FDA, I recruited him to Mass General to work for me as Director of Regulatory Affairs. So I've had this conversation, Barry, a number of times with him, because now that he's on the other side, helping us develop the treatments, he does acknowledge that the FDA traditionally has taken a very conservative approach. You know, to the point that, just to give you an idea, you know, it's a paradoxical, in the depression trials, we use scales like the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, the Montgomery-Asberg, and when sponsors use better, you know, univariate scales like the HAM-D6 or the MATTER-6, the FDA says, oh my God, you're not using the original 17-item scale that in 1958 Max Hamilton developed, so we're upset with you for deviating from that norm. So I think that, you know, we have to, in my mind, more and more push regulatory agencies to be flexible, to accept different endpoints, even if they were not established in the 1950s.
Next question.
Yeah.
Yes, I know we've been through an interesting discussion on AI, and I'm going to keep my question kind of short. I've been on the boards at Partners and MGH, and this is sort of a broadband question that relates to how this whole discussion has come about. I think we all believe in AI, but I'm concerned about overselling AI now in terms of what it can do and what it promises to do, even though we're all working on it. And that is, how many of the variables in the equation do we actually understand right now? This whole discussion has been about, we're still figuring out things, where they plug in and how they interact. So that's one question. Second question is, how will we measure success? Those are my two questions.
So, you know, I can speak for my domain anyway, which is the brain imaging of neuropsychiatric disorders. I think we're finally pretty much there, but we have to prove it. And I think the techniques are mature enough, the neuroscience is mature enough, our knowledge of the variables is mature enough. And so, but the next step really is what all of us, you know, want with our work, which is translation. And I think that it will have to be empirically validated, but you can already show the degree to which certain algorithms can produce certain types of results with certain types of sensitivity and specificity, and stratify. So I think the last thing any of us would want to do is oversell it. In the spirit of this meeting, I think we're all sort of saying we're getting close, and this time it's different for these reasons, and you're challenging us to specify exactly why and how that is.
You know, Art, one outcome, I mean, just one drug repurposed successfully that came out of a in silico machine learning search could do wonders, right? So I think you're going to have different outcomes in different areas that are more immediate, and then for maybe a new therapy versus a new way to just predict disease early or promote brain health early.
The only thing I'll add, if we keep discovering new variables and they change our definition.
Sure. Yep.
But the one very other quickly, what's nice about this kind of approach is that to some extent we don't actually have to know that much about the variables. They can be a little bit murky and still be useful. And most of these systems that are developed, if new variables appear or become available because a new measurement or whatever, they could be plugged in relatively easy so that you can actually build on what you've already done. They're not necessarily changing the entire structure. And that's a powerful aspect that makes it, less likely to be obsolete.
Let's go to the next question.
Ken Morse, Entrepreneurship Ventures. It's no coincidence that we were sitting next to each other because we have the same kind of mindset. But this morning was, I thought, brilliant, inspirational, uplifting, and full of forward-looking statements, which he wasn't able to do when he ran a public company for 20 years. And then Maurizio pointed out that Dr. Sabina Wilhelm wasn't giving a forward-looking statement. She was talking about actual results. So I think, Maurizio and Oliver, could you say a little bit more about the actual results of applying a combination of machine learning, AI, and big data to real patients?
Sure. No, I think that when Sabine Wilhelm presented the data today, even though applied to a small group, you could see the power of an intervention delivered digitally, virtually to a community that is spread out in the United States. And then the fact that she's concretely planning the next step for a larger trial, again, virtual, but with concrete results, concrete changes in behavior that a standard scale like the Y-box can detect. If you then merge that approach to a precision medicine approach, that will further enhance its efficacy. Oliver?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I really enjoyed Sabina's presentation this morning. I think the only thing I would add is what I think we've got in that tool is a really nice blend of the orthodox and traditional on one side, so a very structured form of cognitive behavioral therapy for an important disorder, the Y-box score, which is the gold standard score for the disorder, with a bit of next generation personalization thinking. So if you're fortunate enough to receive clinical therapy from Sabina's team, you know you're going to be having 1 hour of therapy per week. You know the therapist you're going to be seeing, you know the office you're going to be in when you have it, which is great. But then what if you didn't quite hear what was being said in that therapy session? You've got to wait another week. If you're highly motivated because you've got a terrible disorder and you've got an app, you can deep dive into the same topic again and again and again, and you can make sure that for the modules which are very helpful for you, you can max out on your exposure to that therapy. And what we're seeing in the data from the users is different modules work or get more interest from different people, which is a form of personalization. And this is something the technology can do, but it all has to be underpinned by a very structured, orthodox approach to treatment and knowing what the outcome is that you're trying to deliver. And then you can play some jazz, right?
Yeah, so we're just about out of time. We have just a minute or so left, but maybe a quick comment, Tom?
Yeah, fairly quick. My name is Matt. I'm a medical student in the UK. I was just wondering about the panel's kind of thoughts on what machine learning is going to do to functional MRI in clinical practice. Fairly limited scope at the moment, but with machine learning techniques, like what sort of conditions do you think it might become useful in?
So I think it's going to become useful across the board because these disorders do have, and since the 80s, there's been sort of hypothesis-driven smaller studies with more univariate and now recently resting state connectivity, multivariate techniques. I think the combination of task-based and novel algorithms and optimized signal-to-noise can allow the foundation for the precision medicine, really, and for the identification of subjects within a trial who will or will not have a pattern that has been associated with an outcome of interest to pharma. And so the ability to accelerate and de-risk and provide targets and understand at least systems level mechanisms is something that we're working very hard on. So
Yeah, so we're out of time. We'd like to thank you all for staying engaged and thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you very much.